In addition to using bridging and manually knitting needles back against the rail, you can also work the yarn around a gauge of some sort as you form each stitch by hand to create really large stitches. In this case, I'm using a wooden knitting needle, which I really kind of like because the wood doesn't slip around very much. It's easier for me to hold on to. And I'm passing the yarn around the gauge, hand knitting the stitch. Around the gauge, hand knit the stitch. If I wanted to get really enormous stitches, I could probably still knit these needles all the way back against the rail and create even larger stitches. Let's see what the difference between these is when I finish this row. Now at the end of the row, I think that the easiest way to manage this is to just bring all of the needles right out to holding position so nothing slips off the needles, and then to pull out the gauge. And I'm going to knit a row across this so that you can see the difference. This is where I knitted the stitches back, just catching the yarn around this size 13 wooden knitting needle. And over here on the right, you can see the stitches are about twice as long. I not only passed the yarn around the gauge, I also knitted those individual needles right back against the rail. Now you could also use just a flat gauge instead. So let's try it with a common ruler and see what happens there. I'm going to unthread the carriage and I'm going to free pass over to the right side so that it's out of the way. And initially I think you'll find that it's a little awkward holding on to any of the gauges. So I'm going to kind of fudge it along here one-handed just to get a few stitches in to hold. And then once you've got a couple of stitches in there, you'll find that it's a lot easier to hold on to. And again, I'm going to pass the yarn around and manually knit a needle back. Would I want to do a whole sweater like this? I don't think so. But for occasional rows of really huge stitches for very special effects, or for a pattern where perhaps the stitches only need to be enlarged every 4th or 5th or 6th row, then I think this is a quite doable way of producing those huge stitches. And I could do it part way across a row if it was an effect that wasn't going to travel the full width of the fabric. And if I needed to interrupt the carriage to do that, I would do it by bridging. I would bridge up to that point, and where in the previous examples I showed you just manually knitting the needles back, in addition to doing that, you would be able to bridge up to this point and then work around a gauge. And once again, for those really enormous stitches, I can knit those needles all the way back to the rail. And I think you can see that once I had the first few of these wraps in and secured, that holding onto the gauge isn't such a big issue. If it was giving you some trouble, I suppose you could use a rubber band or a clip of some kind to hold it for a few of the stitches, but I don't really think you're going to need any help with it once you get going. And obviously, if you were going to do row after row of really huge stitches, then there'd be no reason to knit a row in between. You could just reinsert the gauge and start working from right to left now. And in that case, I would be very careful not to tighten up in a way that's going to disturb the previous row of stitches. The few end stitches might tighten up a bit, but I think that if you're just careful with your tension, you'll be okay with that. And again, once you get past these first few, it's a lot easier to hold on to all of it. I've got it leaning against the end of the sinker plate of the carriage, and that seems to be helping a bit. these huge stitches were formed by working around a gauge and manually knitting the needles back. And this first band of stitches was done working around the size 13 wooden knitting needle, and then up here working around a standard ruler. And you can see that the stitches are really, really huge.